Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
Good morning and welcome to today's episode. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and each day I invite you to join me as we reflect on a significant moment from our shared past. Today is November 11th, and we're looking back 405 years to November 11th, 1620. On that day, aboard a small ship anchored off the coast of what would become Massachusetts, 41 men gathered in the cramped main cabin to sign a document. The ship was the Mayflower. The document, just 200 words long, would become known as the Mayflower Compact. In that brief text, these men, religious separatists and adventurers alike, created something unprecedented. They wrote their own government into existence. With no charter, no royal authority, and no legal permission to settle where they had landed, they decided to govern themselves through mutual consent. They agreed to create laws for the common good and promised to obey those laws. It was a social contract written before John Locke theorized about social contracts, a democratic agreement created more than 150 years before the Declaration of Independence. The Mayflower Compact wasn't just a practical solution to an immediate problem. It became a foundational document in American political thought, proof that free people could come together, agree to be governed, and create legitimate authority through consent rather than through force or inherited power. The story of why and how it was written tells us something important about the origins of democratic self-government. To understand why the Mayflower Compact was necessary, we need to understand the desperate situation these voyagers faced. The Pilgrims, as they would later be called, were English separatists who had broken away from the Church of England. In an era when religion and political authority were inseparable, this made them criminals. They had fled England for the Netherlands, where they could worship freely. But after a decade in Holland, they decided to seek a fresh start in the New World. They obtained permission from the Virginia Company to establish a settlement in its territory, which extended as far north as modern-day New York. They weren't rebels or revolutionaries. They had legal authorization to settle and expected to operate under English law and the Virginia Company's charter. But nothing went according to plan. The voyage was grueling. The Mayflower left England in September 1620 with about 102 passengers, including the separatist Pilgrims, but also other English colonists seeking economic opportunity. The Atlantic crossing took 66 days through autumn storms. The ship was blown far off course. When they finally sighted land on November 9th, 1620, they were at Cape Cod, hundreds of miles north of their intended destination, far outside the boundaries of the Virginia Company's territory. This created a serious legal and political problem. The Virginia Company's charter didn't apply where they had landed. They had no legal authority to settle here. They had no government, no laws, no recognized leadership structure. They were, in effect, outside the reach of English law and control. And some of the passengers, particularly the non-pilgrim adventurers who had come for profit rather than religious freedom, recognized this immediately. According to William Bradford, who would become Plymouth Colony's governor and historian, some of these men began saying that once ashore they would use their own liberty, for none had power to command them. In other words, mutiny was brewing. Without legal authority to enforce obedience, the voyage's leaders feared the colony would dissolve into chaos before it even began. They needed to establish legitimate authority quickly and have everyone agree to submit to it. What happened next was remarkable. Rather than trying to assert authority through force or appealing to their now invalid charter, the Pilgrim leaders proposed something different. They would create a government by mutual agreement. Everyone would participate in forming the colony's political structure and agree to abide by the laws and leadership they collectively established. This was radical for several reasons. First, in early 17th century England, political authority descended from the king who ruled by divine right. Government wasn't something people created. It was something established by God through monarchy and inherited through bloodlines. The idea that ordinary people could simply write a government into existence was foreign to most English political thought. Second, the compact didn't just create a government. It created a government based on consent of the governed. The men who signed it weren't being commanded or forced. They were voluntarily agreeing to a system of self-governance. Authority would flow upward from the people rather than downward from a monarch. Third, the compact established that laws would be made for the general good of the colony, not for the benefit of any particular person or group. This was an early expression of the common good as the proper purpose of government. The text itself was concise and carefully worded. It began by acknowledging King James and their loyalty to England. This wasn't rebellion against English authority, just practical governance in its absence. Then came the crucial passage. The signers agreed to covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation. They promised to create just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices for the colony's general good, and they pledged submission to those laws and officers. 41 adult men signed the compact on November 11, 1620. Women and children weren't signers. This was still the 17th century, and political participation was limited to adult men. But the document they created would have implications far beyond their immediate situation. The Mayflower Compact solved the immediate crisis of potential mutiny, but it couldn't solve the far more pressing problem, survival. The Pilgrims came ashore in November at a place they called Plymouth. They had arrived too late in the season to plant crops. They had inadequate supplies. They knew little about the land or how to survive in it. They were physically weakened from the voyage. The first winter was catastrophic. By spring, half the colonists had died from disease, exposure, and malnutrition. Entire families were wiped out. At one point, only 7 healthy adults remained to care for the sick and dying. The colony came terrifyingly close to complete failure. What saved them was a combination of luck, help from native peoples, and the social cohesion created partly by the compact's framework. The Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, decided to ally with the Plymouth colonists, a decision driven by complex political calculations about other native groups rather than simple goodwill. Members of the Wampanoag, particularly Tisquantum, known as Squanto, taught the colonists how to plant corn, where to fish, and how to survive in this environment. The compact system of self-governance helped the colony weather internal conflicts and make collective decisions during those early, desperate months. When they needed to organize work parties, distribute scarce resources, and maintain order, they had an agreed-upon framework for doing so. John Carver, elected as the first governor under the compact, provided leadership until his death in April 1621. William Bradford succeeded him and would govern Plymouth Colony for most of the next 3 decades. Plymouth Colony never became large or prosperous compared to other English settlements. It remained small, poor, and agricultural. In 1691, it was absorbed into the much larger Massachusetts Bay Colony, but its political legacy outlasted its physical existence. For the first century after its signing, the Mayflower Compact was mainly a local curiosity, a practical document that had helped establish one small colony. But during the Revolutionary era, Americans searching for historical precedents for self-government rediscovered it. John Adams praised the compact as evidence of New England's commitment to self-governance and the consent of the governed. John Quincy Adams called it the birth of constitutional liberty in America. Later, historians and politicians cited it as proof that American democracy had deep roots, stretching back to the founding of Plymouth Colony. This wasn't entirely accurate. The signers weren't modern Democrats. They were 17th century English people who believed in monarchy, strict social hierarchy, and religious uniformity. Plymouth Colony was a theocracy where church and civil government were intertwined. The government they created was far from democratic by our standards. But the compact did establish one crucial precedent. Legitimate government could be created through written agreement among the governed. This was a genuinely revolutionary concept, and its influence can be traced through subsequent American political documents. When the Mayflower Compact was written, social contract theory, the idea that government authority derives from an agreement among the governed, was still being developed by European philosophers. Thomas Hobbes wouldn't publish Leviathan until 1651. John Locke's two treatises of government appeared in 1689. Yet here were English colonists in 1620 putting a version of social contract theory into practice, even if they couldn't articulate it in philosophical terms. The compact's influence appears in how later American colonies were established and governed. Colonial charters often included provisions for local self-government. Town meetings and representative assemblies became common in New England. The idea that settlers could organize themselves politically rather than simply receiving government from above took root. The Mayflower Compact resonates today, not because it was a perfect document or created a perfect society. It did neither, but because it articulated principles that remain central to democratic governance. The first principle is consent of the governed. The compact signers didn't inherit their government or have it imposed on them. They created it through mutual agreement. Every modern democracy rests on some version of this idea. Governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the people they govern, not from force, tradition, or divine right. The second principle is the social contract. The compact expressed the idea that people can come together and agree to form a political community, establishing mutual obligations and creating authority through agreement. This concept underlies every democratic constitution, including the U.S. Constitution, which begins with "We the people" and outlines a government created by popular consent. The third principle is the rule of law. The signers promised to abide by the laws they collectively created. They weren't exempting themselves from the regulations or claiming special privileges. Everyone, including leaders, would be subject to the same laws. This commitment to the rule of law, rather than the rule of influential individuals, is fundamental to constitutional democracy. The fourth principle is the common good. The compact stated that laws would be created for the general good of the colony. Government exists to serve collective welfare, not the interests of rulers or privileged groups. This principle appears in the preamble to the Constitution, which lists purposes like establish justice, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. Of course, the Mayflower Compact's high-minded principles coexisted with practices we now recognize as deeply flawed. The Plymouth colonists displaced and occasionally fought with native peoples. They executed or expelled those who challenged religious orthodoxy. They accepted slavery. In 1623, Plymouth colonists acquired their first enslaved person. The compact of self-governance applied only to some people, not all. This contradiction between inclusive political principles and exclusive practice has run throughout American history. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal in a nation where millions were enslaved. The Constitution created a government by consent while excluding most adults from political participation. The Civil Rights Movement demanded that America live up to its stated principles. This ongoing struggle to expand the circle of we the people and extend the social contract's benefits to everyone reflects the incomplete nature of democracy. The Mayflower Compact reminds us that democracy isn't a fixed system, but an ongoing project. The 41 men who signed it in 1620 created something imperfect but valuable, a framework for self-governance based on mutual consent. Subsequent generations have expanded, challenged, and reimagined that framework. Each generation faces the question the Mayflower passengers faced. How do we govern ourselves? Who gets to participate? What obligations do we have to each other and to the common good? How do we create legitimate authority and hold leaders accountable? In our current era of political polarization and challenges to democratic norms, these questions feel particularly urgent. When political legitimacy is questioned, when leaders refuse to accept election results, when citizens can't agree on basic facts, the social contract itself comes under strain. The Mayflower Compact's lesson is that self-governance requires active, ongoing consent and commitment to collective decision-making, especially when we disagree. The Compact also reminds us that political communities can be created intentionally through explicit agreement about mutual obligations and shared purposes. We're not condemned to accept whatever political arrangements we inherit. Like the Mayflower passengers, we can decide how we want to be governed and create systems that embody our values and serve our common good. This doesn't mean starting from scratch. We have constitutions, laws, and institutions that provide stability and continuity. But it does mean recognizing that democracy is participatory. It requires active engagement, not passive acceptance. The social contract isn't something signed once and then forgotten. It's renewed through participation in democratic processes, through holding leaders accountable, through working toward the common good. 405 years ago, 41 men crowded into a ship's cabin and created a government through agreement rather than force. They had no philosophical text to guide them, no historical models to follow. They were solving an immediate practical problem: how to maintain order and survive in a harsh environment where they had no legal authority. Yet their practical solution articulated principles that would shape American democracy: consent of the governed, social contract, rule of law, and commitment to the common good. These principles remain foundational to democratic self-government. They're not self-executing. They require constant effort and renewal. But they provide a framework for free people to govern themselves collectively. The Mayflower Compact wasn't perfect. The society it helped create was far from just by our standards. But it represented a crucial step toward the idea that ordinary people can create legitimate government through mutual agreement, and that authority flows from consent rather than force. In a world where democracy faces challenges from authoritarian movements, and where cynicism about self-governance is growing, it is essential to remember the founding moment of democratic creation. The great philosopher George Santayana once wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." The Mayflower Compact teaches us that democracy begins with consent, with people coming together to create government for their common good. Maintaining democracy requires the same ongoing commitment to mutual agreement, collective decision-making, and shared responsibility that those 41 signers pledged in a ship's cabin on a November day in 1620. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Richard Backus, and I'll be back tomorrow with another story from our shared past.